Have you seen that Carrie remake? It's a real piece of shit.
Oh, remakes. Usually pieces of shit. What makes a remake good? What makes a remake bad? Let's discuss that today. And to really bring out the topic, we're going to talk about Suspiria, the remake.
I don't know what to say.
I think I ruined the New Yorker. Treating it like an Atlantic. Speaking of pretentious art house films, Suspiria is considered to be a classic. It's an Italian horror film originally by Dario Argento. We here are huge fans of the original Suspiria, and we've been having a lot of conversations lately in anticipation of the new remake coming out about what made the old movie work so well, and kind of anticipating what direction the new movie would take. And one of the conversations that came out of that was a discussion asking, when is it okay to make a remake? Why are we excited about this remake and we weren't excited about any of the others? Why were we not excited about Carrie? Aside from the fact that they were clearly going to butcher a classic. You can make a remake for a number of reasons. Sometimes it's because the original film is a bit outdated. So the 1920s Scarface versus the Al Pacino Scarface. It's really trying to recontextualize a story that may not have aged well or may no longer be relevant. And sometimes you just got gratuitous remakes, like the original We're No Angels with Humphrey Bogart, remade with Sean Penn. They lost one of the angels, they lost the entire plot. It's a really different name. It should have a different name. It's a different movie. I don't know why they even did that. Sometimes you want to go for a stylistic change, so you do the old John Carpenter Halloween, and you do the Rob Zombie Halloween. And in that case, all you're really doing is you're just changing it up from kind of, what's the phrase, a good movie to a shitty one. But what made the Halloween remake a shitty one? Well, if you want to be Rob Zombie, and you want to make a Rob Zombie movie, and you want to have a Rob Zombie killer, make that movie. Just make that movie. It doesn't have to be Halloween. Michael Myers doesn't have to be a generic Rob Zombie killer. And when you do that, you're kind of crossing the streams, as it were, about what people liked about the original and what it is that you want to do.
Ghostbusters!
I am not even gonna touch that. It raises an interesting question, right? And that big question is, at a certain time, is there really a value in recreating something that's already been there? You get the benefits of capitalizing on the audience that's there from the original. And sometimes that makes people angry because they're saying, you're ruining the original. Now, I don't believe that's really possible. Just because Rob Zombie made 2 awful Halloween movies doesn't mean that I can't go back and enjoy the originals. Just because they remade Ghostbusters doesn't ruin Ghostbusters 1. And it can't ruin Ghostbusters 2 because, ugh. And sometimes you kind of see shadow remakes, as it were, as I'm inventing the phrase in this moment. If you look at like Rambo with Sylvester Stallone, the guy that plays Rambo. It doesn't even acknowledge the first 3. Really all it is it's a film about a Rambo-esque character in a Rambo-esque place doing Rambo-esque things. And it's really good in its own right. Now there are some elements to it that tie into the originals, but it would be a really good standalone film. That to me is kind of what you're striving for in a remake, is you're capturing some themes, maybe you're changing it and recontextualizing it and re-exploring these concepts and characters in a completely new place. But it works out best when it does feel like it almost is completely disconnected from the originals. How does this all tie in together? Aside from the fact that Chloe Grace Moretz is in both Carrie and Suspiria. Suspiria ties into a lot of this conversation because the trailer alone shows the affection and the love of the original film. The images they're projecting in the trailer, the music they're using in the trailer, feels like something that is celebrating the original Suspiria. And Suspiria also works as a remake for several reasons. One, it's an Italian horror film, and with Italian horror films, and especially those from the 70s, there are some aging issues. I mean, the biggest problem that I have with Suspiria is that the audio dubbing is pretty awful. The English dubbing to me is just the worst part of that film. But it's a gorgeous movie, it's a suspenseful movie, and it works really well as like a fairy tale almost, of just this woman in this horrifying place. A dancer, she comes to this dance studio, and as these horrible, macabre things are happening, she discovers, witches, as you'd expect. And all of that could work really well, regardless of time and place. But recapturing with newer technology, recreating that story on a grander scale, is something that I actually think could have a lot of potential. So we saw that movie this week, and there's been a lot of conversation amongst ourselves about it. The biggest thing I would say about the new Suspiria is, while it definitely seems to respect and cherish and idolize the original, it makes zero effort to be the original. And that's a very, very important thing for a director to choose to do. Because at the same time, you're both taking on all the flack from the people who are saying you're about to ruin one of my favorite movies, but you're also shedding yourself of both the burden of trying to recreate what's already been done while unabashedly creating something entirely original and in your own mold. And this film really works in that sense. One of the key areas where the new Suspiria diverges from the old one is the older film really plugged you into this dance studio, and you were following this outsider character as she was learning what was happening around her. And that's really good for immersing the audience, and as she learns new information, so do we. The story is being told to us through her. That's very effective storytelling. In the newer film, you do have the newer dance student who's coming into the studio, but you don't really learn much about her. One of the complaints that I heard about it, and I wouldn't disagree, is there is a lack of character development in the film. However, there are really interesting characters. What that means is that occasionally you're stuck with sort of one or two-dimensional characters who don't progress much throughout the movie, but they hit the beats that they need to progress the story and continually propel us toward the inevitable conclusion. Aesthetically, the film is really, really pretty, and it does this without mimicking what Argento did in terms of color theory and really abstract, I want to say almost like expressionistic kind of cinematography and lighting, but he really did pioneer a unique look that became Italian cinema in the 70s, right? Luca G, I'll put his name right here because I can't pronounce it in the slightest, the director of the new Suspiria, opts to instead take on more of a literal approach and a lot more of the visual stimulus, a lot more of the scares are done in editing. Not in terms of like CGI or graphics, but in terms of how things are cut, how music is involved. Historically, Suspiria is also sort of known for its soundtrack. The original soundtrack was composed by the Goblins. The newer soundtrack is composed by Tom York from Radiohead. So once again, a fantastic soundtrack that really blends in well with the surrounds. And it helps to tell kind of, much like Radiohead's music, it helps to tell kind of a bizarrely disjointed, atmospheric, and epic feeling story. What are some other changes? If you're going to remake it, if you're going to change things, if you're going to make any decisions about how to treat an old property anew, you have to ask the question, why? Why are we changing things? Why are we moving things? Why are we making this film in the first place? The biggest difference, I would say, between the old Suspiria and the new Suspiria is that the original Suspiria, again, really plays out like a fairy tale where even if you think as the audience you know where it's going, it's just a progressively unfolding, unwinding story that really follows a tragic character who's just trying to survive. The newer Suspiria has a lot more suspense, even though it shows the shark pretty quickly. It outright tells you there are witches. It outright kind of lays out the risks, the challenge, the stakes. And to carry on a film like that for 2.5 hours is a challenge. So how does the film do that? Strong characters, which is different from characterization. Solid acting. And on the topic of acting, great acting from Chloe Grace Moretz, great acting from Dakota Johnson, who's the star of the film. And the writing is tight enough where each scene does feel complete to itself. A lot of scenes do feel like their own smaller movies. Another difference is that the original Suspiria sort of had the evil of this coven manifested in this unseen killer with a knife. The newer film kind of does away with that. It's more of your traditional witch-based terror and evil, which is actually very, very effective and leads to some of the most grotesque, shocking, and yet beautiful horror scenes that I've seen in a very long time. The biggest thing? The new Suspiria offers what I don't feel the old Suspiria offered, and that's more resolution. Some of the downsides, as I said, it is a bit of a longer film, so if you struggle with films over 2 hours, it can kind of feel like a beating. There were a couple times in the movie where I wasn't sure why certain subplots were included, and then by the end, they sort of justified themselves, and I really enjoyed them. I thought it was a very coherent and tight script, but I think a lot of people might struggle to kind of follow along and pay attention with some of it, not because it's perplexing, but because it's differently paced. If you're going into it looking for that kind of Argento scare factor, it's really not the same thing. I would say it's closer to if you took Suspiria but put it through like the lens of A Black Swan by Darren Aronofsky. I mean, it just has more of that real world feel, that real world vibe. And part of that, in some ways, actually deals with the fact that these characters aren't developed typically for several reasons. Knowing too much about them kind of diminishes their fear factor. It kind of takes away from how spooky they are. Like I said, I would still say there's poor characterization, but I understand why it happened. So for me, I can look past that, and I'm kind of okay with that and still would recommend it. For other people I saw it with, it was tough for them to sit through it and stick around through it, because without interesting characters being developed, why are we here? So I can see both sides of it, but at the end of the day, Whether you have seen the original or not, this film really does stand alone as a really solid contribution to horror and atmospheric horror. And it falls into that perfect kind of niche where I think it literally should be called horror, but really it's more of a suspenseful thriller. And I think a lot more people are amenable to that. It might sound semantic, but most people who hear thriller know exactly what I mean. You can have horror elements, but it's more thematic, more plot-based. It's a horror film to me that really stands on its own. And for a remake, that's the highest praise you can give it, is it doesn't in any way feel like it's trying to ape the original. It doesn't replace the original. It is its own movie, and it's beautiful in its own right. If you're not into horror, if you're not into suspense, and you're not into witches and the evil things they can do with magic, and if you really want a story that's more character-driven, Suspiria is probably not for you. The biggest thing is if you like the original or if you don't like the original, the new one really stands on its own. And by trying to really make something of itself and try to be a great film in and of itself, while taking the idea and being consistent with it, that to me is what a good remake is, and it's a very effective remake in that sense. So yeah, I think most people should go see Suspiria.
You fucked up the New Yorker.
Well, you brought up Carrie, and I fucking don't like that movie, so it's my subscription anyway.